I'm going to be pointing to the board, at least in theory. I suppose I expect to be pointing to the board a little bit more today than ordinarily. The usual function of my equivalent of PowerPoint isn't quite the same today because I'm taking an interest in some of these diagrammatic matters as well. And as I say, I will be pointing to them. All right, so to begin, I'm actually going to postpone something that you're probably already wondering about, although it will come into this lecture and on a couple of occasions. That is to say, the full relationship in terms of the influence of both movements between the Russian formalists and Saussure's notion of semiology and semiotics until next week when we discuss Roman Jakobson's essay Linguistics and Poetics, where I think the relationship between the two movements in which he himself was involved will become clearer and will come into focus more naturally than if I tried to outline what the connection between the two movements is now. So that is an aspect of our sequence of lectures, beginning with the last one, that will be postponed until next week. Now, semiotics is not in itself a literary theory. As we'll learn from Jakobson next week, literature can be understood, or what he calls sort of the study of literature, poetics, can be understood as a subfield of semiotics, but semiotics is not in itself a literary theory. In other words, perhaps to your frustration, what you read today has nothing at all in and of itself to tell you about literature. This isn't the last time this will happen during the course of the syllabus. But then, of course, our job is to bring out the implications for literature of texts that we read that don't have any direct bearing on literary study. The important thing about Saussure and the discipline of semiotics is the incredible influence that it has had on virtually every form of subsequent literary theory, and that's what we need to keep in mind. Semiotics evolves into what is called structuralism, which we will be considering next week, and that in turn, as it were, bequeaths its terminology and its set of issues and frameworks for thinking to deconstruction, to Lacanian psychoanalysis, to French Marxism, to binary theories of race, colonization, and gender. In other words, to a great deal that we will be studying subsequently on this syllabus. So while, again, what we read for today is not in itself literary theory, it is nevertheless crucially formative for a great many of the developments in literary theory that we'll be studying. Now, just as an anecdotal or conjectural aside, I've always found it so fascinating I can never resist talking about it. The relationship between various texts in our field, history of criticism, literary theory, texts that are considered foundational, which, curiously enough, a la Foucault, don't actually have an author. Aristotle's Poetics, we know actually not to have been one of the texts written by Aristotle, but rather to be a compendium of lecture notes put together by his students. And this is one of the reasons why in the golden age of Arabic scholarship in the Middle Ages, there was so much dispute about the Poetics. The manuscripts we find from this period are full of marginal notes where the scholars are chiding each other and saying, no, it can't be that way. In other words, in a way, it's a disputed text. And it is not written by Aristotle. It's a foundational text. Aristotle is considered the father of criticism, and yet he is so as what Foucault would call a founder of discursivity. Well, the odd thing is it's exactly the same with Saussure, who can be considered the father or patriarch of a certain kind of literary theory, as I've just indicated. Saussure's Course in General Linguistics is not something written by Saussure, but is a compendium of lecture notes written by his students in a series of lectures that he gave from 1906 to 1911, and then gathered together in book form by two of his disciples who were linguists. Now, it's odd that we have that this text does have the same formative function. Scholars who go to Geneva go for a variety of reasons when they look at the Saussure archive. Some of them are predisposed to dislike Saussure and to hope that they can somehow discredit him by learning more about things that he thought that aren't actually in the text. Others like Saussure and feel that he needs to be rescued from his compositors, and yet others go in an attitude of worship and hope that the archive will yield to them full confirmation of the integrity of the text we call the course in general linguistics. So that, in a way, the study of the Saussure archive, given the volatile relationship of that archive with the actual text that we have, is a kind of map that, if one were to study it, one could associate with the history of thinking about literary theory in the 20th century. This is really all neither here nor there. I just find it interesting that two people who are incontestably founders of discursivity in the field that we study are in fact not, strictly speaking, authors, somehow or another confirming the insight of Foucault in the essay that we began by reading. Anyway, enough of that. We have to try to figure out what Saussure is up to, and let's move on to begin to do so. Semiology. What is semiology? It's the study of existing conventional communicative systems. All of these systems we can call languages, and language, that is to say the words that we use when we speak to each other, is one of those systems. Other systems, the gestures that mimes use, semaphores, railroad semaphores, a stoplight, red, green, yellow, is a semiotic system. In other words, all of them are modes of communication with which we function, the intelligibility of which allows us to negotiate the worlds around us. Semiotics has expanded into every imaginable aspect of thought. There is a Darwinian semiotics, understanding the relationships among species in semiotic terms. There is, in other words, a semiotics of virtually every imaginable thing understood as a language made up of a system of signs. Signs we'll be getting to in a minute. But in the meantime, it's important to understand what semiology actually is. That's what it is. Now, I meant to ask you, how many of you did not bring the passages that I sent to you by email last night? All right, we have them here, and they'll be passed around. We have about 25 copies, so don't take one if you don't need it. I'm not going to pause. I am going to be turning to the second passage on the sheet, in which something about the nature of these systems, I think, can be made clear. Language, says Saussure, is not a function of the speaker. And here, of course, he is talking about human language. Human language is not a function of the speaker. It is a product that is passively assimilated by the individual. Now, what does this mean? The fact that human language is not my language, that is to say, the fact that it doesn't originate in me, the fact that it's not, in other words, my private language, is, of course, a certain loss, because it means that when I speak, when I use language in speech, I'm using something that is not strictly my own. It's conventional. That is to say, it belongs in the public sphere to all of us. And there's perhaps a certain sort of romantic loss in that. Wouldn't it be nice if language, in some sense, were my own? But the incredible gain, which makes language something like at the object of science that Saussure is hoping to secure. This is one of the things, obviously, that he has in common with the formalists. The incredible gain is that if language is not private, if it's not my own, if it's not something that I can make up as I go along, if in other words, it is conventional, belonging to all of us, that's precisely what allows it to be communicative. It is a system of signs, in other words, that we can make use of, that we recognize as signs precisely because they exist among us as something that can be shared in common. And so this then is the object of Saussure's attention as a linguist and as a semiotician. Now, what's implied in this idea is that language is something that we use. The best way to say it, and the quickest way to say it, is that I don't speak language. Language is something that exists as an aggregate, all at once, arguably, and this is something that's going to come up again as we come back to these coordinates that we'll be touching on from time to time today also. Arguably, language is something virtual. You remember that Freud said we have to infer the unconscious from the erratic behavior of consciousness. I mean, there's got to be something back there, so we're going to call it the unconscious, and we're going to try to describe it. Very much the same with language, langue, as Saussure calls it. It's something, what we do is speak. And when we speak, of course, we say correctly that we use language. But we still need to know what language is, and we need to understand the relationship between language and speech. Now, we can understand language as a kind of aggregate of everything that's in the lexicon, in the dictionary, together with everything that would be in some sort of ideal or utterly systematized set of rules of grammar and syntax. But there is no real aggregate of that kind. In other words, it exists. It's there to be put together, partly as a matter of experiment and partly as a matter of conjecture by the linguists. But as a composite thing existing in a spatial simultaneity, synchronically, language is something that, in a very real sense, as is the case with Freud, we infer from speech. Now, speech is what we do. Speech is the way in which we appropriate, deploy, and make use of language. And Saussure calls that parole. Parole is the unfolding in time of a set of possibilities given in space. That set of possibilities being what Saussure calls langue. Now, language is a system of signs. What is a sign? Saussure's famous diagrams make it clear enough. We have above the line a concept, and we have below the line a sound image. In other words, I think of something, and that thinking that thinking of something corresponds to a sound image that I have ready to hand for it. And that can be understood in terms of thinking of the concept tree. That's why this is in quotation marks. And I speak Latin. And knowing that the sound image correlative to the concept tree is arbor, right? Or I can think of something like that, something in some way resembling that. And by the same token, I still speak Latin. The sound image corresponding to it is arbor. Now, I may or may not get back to this today, but in this question mark is the secret of deconstruction. All right, just to keep you poised and on tenterhooks. But in the meantime, what Saussure is doing with this relationship above and below the line is he's saying that there is an arbitrary relationship between the concept and the sound image. The concept he calls a signified, and the sound image he calls a signifier. A sign, in other words, is made up of two sides in a, as it were, a thought moment. A relationship between that which is signified and that which signifies it. And it's to be understood that we have to think of them together. They're not divisible. Their relationship is necessary, but, as we'll see in a minute, arbitrary. And each sign is like that. And the way in which we put signs together is to take these bundles, these binary relationships between a concept and a sound image, and adjust them in an unfolding sequence. That's how we speak. That's how we make a sentence. All right, so in a way, the idea that a signifier, a sound that I make, arbor, refers to a concept, and by implication, by very powerful and strong and necessary implication, not to a thing, is not in itself new. The idea that a word signifies an idea and not an object is already fully developed in John Locke's essay on human understanding and is more or less commonly agreed on ever afterwards, and is, as I say, in itself a conventional thought that Saussure adapts and makes use of. But what is new in Saussure, and what really is foundational in semiotics as a science, is two things that Saussure then goes on to say about the sign. The first thing he has to say is that the signified-signifier relationship, as I said, is arbitrary. And the second thing he has to say is that the way in which we know one sign from another, either studying language in the aggregate, whereby clusters of signs exist in associational relation to each other, or studying it in speech acts, in speech, whereby signs exist next to each other in a sequence, the way in which we understand what a sign is differential. So that what's new in Saussure's thinking about the relationship between signified and signifier is the sign tied up in this relationship is both arbitrary and differential. Okay, this is a first walk through some essential ideas. I want to go back to the distinction between language and speech and refer you to the first passage, which now all of you have it, on your sheet. Because, like the Russian formalists, Saussure is chiefly concerned in outlining what he means by semiology, to establish the semiological project as a science. And like the Russian formalists, and in a way like the new critics talking about their academic colleagues, Saussure is vexed by the messiness and lack of system in the study of linguistics. And this is what he says in this first passage. He says, if we study speech from several viewpoints simultaneously, the object of linguistics appears to us as a confused mass of heterogeneous and unrelated things. This is speech. I'm a linguist, and so what do? I study speech. I study speeches. And if I do so, and if I keep thinking about it in a variety of ways, all sorts of frameworks jostle for attention. Saussure continues. This procedure opens the door to several sciences: psychology, anthropology, normative grammar, philology, and so on, which are distinct from linguistics, but which might claim speech in view of the faulty method of linguistics as one of their objects. As I see it, there is only one solution to all the foregoing difficulties. From the very outset, and this is a rather peculiar mixed metaphor, from the very outset, we must put both feet on the ground of language and use language as the norm of all the other manifestations of speech. It's as if he's trying to hold language down. You know, stay there, stay there. We put both feet on the grounds of language so that we have it, so that we have it. So intelligible to us as a system, as something that can be understood precisely differentially, that can be understood in the variety of ways in which language organizes signs. It might be worth pausing over the variety of ways in which we can think of signs in language, all of which have to do with the way in which a given sign might be chosen to go into a speech sentence. I don't know. Take the word ship. Ship is very closely related in sound to certain other words. We won't specify them for fear of a Freudian slip, but that is one cluster. That is one associational matrix or network that one can think of in the arrangement of that sign in language. But there are also synonyms for ship: bark, boat, bateau. A great many other synonyms, sailboat, whatever. And they too exist in a cluster: steamship, ocean liner. In other words, words that don't sound at all the same, but they're contiguous in synonymity. They cluster in that way. And then furthermore, ship is also the opposite of certain things. I mean, and that so that it would also enter into a relationship with train, car, truck, mule, modes of transportation, right? And in all of these ways, ship is clustered associationally in language in ways that make it available to be chosen as appropriate for a certain semantic context that we try to develop when we speak. So that's the way a sign works in language. I mean, this is the tip of the iceberg for any given sign, but it gives you some. And by the way, in what I'm saying, I oversimplify by supposing that the basic constituent of unit of language is a word. Linguists know that that's not at all necessarily the case. Linguists can work at different levels of abstraction with language. I mean, sometimes the basic unit is the phrase, but some other times, but the basic unit is the phoneme, that is to say, the single sound unit. Or if one's studying language as a system of writing, it might be the syllable. It could be the letter, understood either graphically or audibly. And the variety of ways in which one can choose a basic unit in the study of linguistics means that you need a special word for that unit, which is characteristically the tag meme. In other words, whatever you're thinking of as you're systematizing your understanding of language as the basic constituent unit, the word being probably one of the less popular choices, even though that's the one I've just used, the blanket term for that is the tag meme. And so you can understand the associational nature of signs also as tagmemic. Then, of course, since there's a certain amount of semantic payoff, let's say, if you're talking about a phoneme, especially because of the as Saussure will say, and as I'll get back to, misleading onomatopoetic drift of language. Perhaps a certain sound has certain connotations, meaning the sound may cluster as sort of in an associational network. But depending on the unit chosen, then the associational networks will differ but they will still exist as a matrix. In other words, it is always probably, I mean, how else could we have any sense of systematicity in language? It is always probably the case that when I speak, I won't choose just any word. E. E. Cummings actually boldly experimented with this principle, and he attracted the attention of the linguists, particularly a linguist named Del Hymes. E. E. Cummings wrote sentences like, "He danced his did," where did is obviously not a word you would have supposed to be in any way involved in an associational cluster in language. You know, I mean, he danced his did. That is in every sense a misfire, as one school of thinking about language would call it. And yet at the same time, Cummings thumbs his nose at us and deliberately uses that word, almost as though he were issuing a critique of semiotics, but at the same time such that semiotics would probably have available to it its ways and means of refutation. A certain amount of ingenuity is that's all that's required to notice that reiterates the duh sound in danced, and that there are all sorts of combinatory pressures on his consciousness to choose did as opposed to some other seemingly irrelevant word. But in any case, so in any case, you can still, even with these egregious examples, understand language, even in its infinite variety, nevertheless as associational and as clustering its available signs in ways that make them more readily to hand for choice than they might be all other things being equal. Well, in any case, so language is a system of signs. The signs are both arbitrary and differential. Now, what does this mean? This is actually the second thing maybe that we learn under the influence of what we call literary theory and the thinking that surrounds it about the nature of perception. If the sign is both arbitrary and differential, that is to say, if there is no such thing as a natural sign, something that is linked by nature, by the nature of the thing and the word together with a thing. If on one side of the border, as Saussure puts it, we look at a cow and say ox, and if on the other side of the border we look at a cow and say bœuf, and if we cross a considerable body of water and we look at a cow and say cow, plainly the relationship between the thing and the sign, you know, the matrix signifier signified, just doesn't exist. So signs are arbitrary, and they're also differential. I have to be able to distinguish between all the signs I use in any communicative sequence. And how do I do it? By putting in signs which are not other signs. The sign is not linked to the natural world by any natural means, and the sign is not linked to other signs by any natural means. I don't know a unit of language which I use to communicate with you positively. I know it negatively. I know it only because it is not everything else in the terms of its direct relationship with the thing that's most adjacent to it somehow, either through similarity or dissimilarity. It's not that other thing. But generally speaking, the point about a sign is that it's not any other thing. This is true even of homonyms. This is true even of seemingly identical signs, because each has its use value and is only intelligible as it's that which it exists to mean in a certain context. So it is always the case that I can only know what I know if it's a question of being communicated with, having something rendered intelligible for me negatively. I can't know it because it just is either that sign or that is. I don't know it positively. I'm about to give an example of this, which I hope will flesh out what I'm trying to get across. In the meantime, a couple of passages in Saussure that may make the point. Now, not on this version of your sheet, but on the version, not on the version of the sheet that I passed out today, but on the version that I sent electronically last night, there's a fifth passage. And that passage is actually a combination of formulations of Saussure that are in two separate parts of your text. The first one is on page 844. Can this possibly be correct? I hope it can. No, it is not correct. It's page 845, the lower left-hand column, where Saussure says, language is a system of interdependent terms in which the value of each term results solely from the simultaneous presence of the others, as in the diagram just below it. In other words, the value of a term, I say something. The value of the term, I utter a sound. The value of that sound cannot be determined except by its context. I can't know it except by the way in which it differs from everything that surrounds it. And he goes on to say, this is on page 847, about halfway down the left-hand column. He goes on to say, a segment of language can never in the final analysis be based on anything except its non-coincidence with the rest. Arbitrary and differential are two correlative qualities. Now, why don't, and then again, another passage on page 846, the right-hand column, halfway down. Concepts are purely differential and defined not by their positive content, but negatively by their relations with other terms of the system. Now, probably this is hard to accept intuitively. We feel, as we process the world around us, that we know things for and as what they are. We feel, you know, I look at something and I know what it is, forgetting that possibly I only know what it is because of a context in which indeed it is not those other things that are linked to it. Now, I want to take an example. I could use any example, but I'm going to use something which plainly does move around various semiotic systems. It's a piece of language, but it also belongs to other sorts of semiotic system, as we'll immediately see. I want to use the example of the red light. Now, in a stoplight, which is probably just about the simplest semiotic system that we have, it only has three, one is tempted to say variables, plainly differing from each other, red, yellow, and green. We have two ways of thinking about the red light. If we think that our knowledge is positive, we say red in a red light means stop. It is spontaneous to us to say red light means stop. Now, if all we have to go on is just this semiotic system, it's going to be kind of hard to put up resistance to that sort of thinking. Because by the same token, we'll say yellow means pause, green means go. These three lights with their respective colors just do positively mean these things. Everybody knows it. and I'm certainly not thinking when I approach an intersection that when the red light goes on, I'm not saying to myself, oh, not yellow, not green. You know, my mind just doesn't work that way. All right, but still, it's a red light, right? And our hypothesis is that the red light has positive value in the sense that it means a certain thing. It means, we say, stop. Well, suppose the red light appeared on or as the nose of a reindeer. In that case, the red light would be a beacon, which means forward, go, follow me, damn the torpedoes, right? We've got to get these presents distributed. No time to waste, you know. And we race off, you know, perhaps risking an accident. Who knows? We race off under the compulsion of the meaning of the red light, which is go. Right? Now, by the way, there's an anecdote, the truth of which I've never been able to ascertain, that during the Cultural Revolution in China, Madame Mao very much disapproved of the fact that red lights meant stop, because red is, of course, the color of progress. It ought to mean go, forward, and, you know, and everything behind it. But needless to say, her thoughts on the subject were never implemented, because, you know, if one day red light means stop and the next day red light means go, there might be a few problems. And so, and this, by the way, is a way of showing the fact that that everything which appears in a semiotic system is conventional. Right? I mean, there's an emptying out of positive meaning in the very awareness that, after all, the red light could mean go. I'm about to go on and give more examples. It's conventional. Whatever the convention is within a system of differences, that's what makes the sign intelligible. All right, just some other examples. A red light over a street door. Well, that doesn't mean stop. That means go in, come in, right? And of course, it exists in a semiotic relationship to a white light over a street door, which means this is my house. If you wish, you can ring the bell, but I just as soon you stayed out. This light is probably on to keep burglars away, and so stop, right? And the red light is intelligible, in other words, within that semiotic system. Now, over an auditorium door, and of course we've already been gazing at that light back there, and it's not a good example. I wish it didn't say exit, but it does say exit, because that kind of weakens my point. But over many auditorium doors, a red light just hangs there. And obviously it doesn't mean come in the sense of the red light over a street door. It means go out, right? This is the way out. This is the way you get out of here, not this is the way you get in here. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which a red light means neither stop nor go, but we are sort of confining ourselves so far to the ways in which a red light has something to do with locomotion or the lack thereof. And in each new system, you can see it takes on a new meaning, always with respect to whatever it is not. All right, now, well, I mean, we can continue. On a light-up Valentine means don't stop, go. You know, it has this. It has the same function, in other words, of negating its own meaning in another semiotic system. In this case, the semiotic system of the stoplight. On an ambulance or a police car. Admittedly, many of these lights are blue these days, but let's suppose that, you know, tradition prevailing, that they are still red. On an ambulance or a streetcar, they mean get out of the way or stop. Right? In other words, they probably bear a distant relation to the semiotics of the stoplight, and that's probably why red was chosen for ambulances and police cars because they put into your head the notion of stop. But it's a notion that's complicated in this case by the equally imperative notion, get out of the way, which doesn't at all necessarily entail stopping, but rather accelerating in a different direction. And all of that somewhat complicates the picture, but at the same time, I think you can see that there's a connection between those semiotic systems. It's a weak system in terms of color. In the case of ambulance and police car, it's more a question of brightness. As I say, red tends to be chosen, but then, you know, if you get lab experiments showing that that particular color of gas blue is somehow or another, you know, sort of more invasive of your consciousness than red is, then, you know, you move away from the arbitrariness of the choice of red as a color. And as I say, there's a certain instability which could never apply in the semiotics of the stoplight, because there it's not so much a question of the brightness of the color, although that has been experimented with, as you know, but rather the insistence that the color is just that color. And then finally, and here is where, in a way, this is perhaps the most interesting thing, because it forces us to show the complexity, to see the complexity of semiotic relationships. A red light, just to return to the Christian holiday, a red light on a Christmas tree. Now, our first thought is, oh, ha-ha, that has no meaning, right? You know, it's no use talking about the negative relationship between a red light and a green light and a yellow, white, blue, whatever the other colors on the Christmas tree are, because they all have the same value. They're all bright, they're all cheerful, they all say Merry Christmas, etc., etc., etc. So what are you supposed to do with that? Here you've got a red light which doesn't seem to enter into this sense of the arbitrary and differential. Well, that's because it's actually not a gross constituent unit, right? Bright lights is the gross constituent unit. And the variety of those bright lights, which is a matter of aesthetics, the variety of those bright lights is, ironically enough, neutralized by the common signifier governing our understanding of them, which is bright lights, in this case particularly on a tree, or festooning another ornament that has some sort of comparable value. And once you get that, once you get the value Christmas tree, as opposed to red lights being perhaps a part of some Christmas trees, then you see that you're back in a semiotic system, and a very obvious one, because a Christmas tree is a not menorah, a not Kwanzaa candles. A Christmas tree, in other words, is a sign that can only be understood intelligibly in terms of a certain cultural understanding. And we think, of course, you know, I mean, we know what that is. And of course, probably we do. But we're misled in supposing that that's the key to the understanding of it as a sign. Because it's very possible to imagine a circumstance in which someone wouldn't know what it was, forcing us, despite its familiarity, to ask us, well, what is it? And how do we know what it is? And then we realize, once again, that we can only know what it is if we come to understand, in this case, probably it's best to say, a cultural system, understood as a semiosis, a cultural system within which it appears. And so this last version of the red light introduces interesting complications, which I don't think should confuse. I think they should actually show us a little bit more about how we can understand the organization of the things around us and within us as systems of signs. We know that we've already learned from Heidegger and the hermeneutic tradition that we know them as something. But it remains to show how we know them. That is to say, we don't know them positively. I mean, Heidegger raises the interesting fact that we spontaneously recognize something. And that makes us, but that's one of the things which could be dangerous for semiotics, because it would make us think or assume that we know them, that we know things positively. Without thinking, in other words, I know that that's an exit sign. I don't know that it's a white thing with red marks on it, I know that it's an exit sign. But I can't know that. The Saussurean argument is without knowing that it is not all the things that it's not. If it were all the things that it's not, or if it were identical to all the things that somehow or another it's not, then I would be in a very difficult situation because I wouldn't have any means of knowing it in particular. The very fact that I need to know it in particular is what makes me need to know it negatively. And that is, it seems to me, in other words, we now know two things about how we perceive things from the standpoint of this subject matter, and it's very useful to put them together. The fact that we always know things first, but at the same time, the fact that it's misleading to think that our knowing them first means that we know them positively. We know them first, but we also know them negatively, in negation to other things. Okay, so let me just return once again to the way in which sign systems are intelligible. Because, you know, I mean, there are going to be lots of moments in a course like this in which what we seem to be saying is, oh, we can't know anything, or we don't know what we know, or how do we know what we know, and maybe we're skirting rhetorical questions of that kind, but we're really not. What we're talking about today is how we do know things. Right? If we take semiotics seriously, it gives us a rather sophisticated means of understanding precisely how we know things. But it insists that we know things because of their conventional nature. That is to say, because they are conventions existing within a system of conventions. Insofar as we don't recognize them, things, signs, as existing, because if we're thinking about a thing, we're thinking about that thing as a sign in semiotics. If we don't know that, if we don't recognize its existence in a system, if we can't think what system it belongs to, perhaps to put it in a better way, that's tantamount to saying we really don't know what it is. And I think the more we think about it, the more we realize that we only know what it is if we know the system that it belongs to, which is to say, all of the things related to it which it is not. Right. Okay, so the intelligibility of sign systems is their conventionality. That's why it's impossible for anybody to come along and say, oh, I don't like the fact that the red light is red. It's symbolically the wrong move. Let's make the red light the symbol of go. You know, I mean, with the ecological movement, it would be very difficult to make the green light the symbol of stop. But in any case, all sorts of complications would arise, right? But in the meantime, you see that we can't mess with conventional systems by imposing the individuality of our will on them and expecting anything to change. A seeming exception is the fact that sometimes individuals can, through the exertion of their influence and prestige, actually change the way we speak about things. This is a seeming exception. Think about the way Jesse Jackson almost single-handedly convinced us that we should use the expression African American, even though it's a cumbersome polysyllabic expression which you would think somehow or another would be intuitively rejected because it's so hard to say. But it worked. He convinced us all to say African American, and you say to yourself, aha, there's an example of somebody taking language by the scruff of the neck and changing it as an individual, exerting an individual will over against the conventional nature of language. The answer, the semiotician's answer to this is, it never could have happened simply as an act of agency, as an act of will. It had to be acquiesced in. You needed the community that makes use of linguistic conventions to acquiesce in a change of use. Remember, Language exists synchronically. It only exists in a moment of simultaneity. We study language diachronically. That is to say, we study its history. We study its unfolding in time. Now, this unfolding is not, according to the semiotician, and here's another link with the Russian formalist, is not a question of studying the way in which language is changed from without. That is to say, studying the way in which, for example, an individual can rise up and insist on changing one of the signs, but rather a sequence of synchronic cross-sections. From moment to moment, language changes. But if we're to understand it as language, we have to honor its simultaneity. And in that case, we understand it as a sequence of cross-sections rather than something that somehow organically changes through time. And at each cross-section, people are either willing to use a certain sign in a certain way or they're not. That's the crucial thing. If they're not willing, the use of the sign doesn't work, which confirms the idea that nothing can be changed simply by individual agency in and of itself. All right, I need to come back to synchrony and diachrony. I'll do so next time and probably in subsequent lectures, because we're going to keep using these coordinates. We're going to keep using the things that exist in space, virtual or not, and the things that unfold in time in their relationship with each other as we continue to try to understand these basic principles which shape so much of subsequent literary theory. Thank you. Last time I lectured under the illusion that all you had been assigned for, I really should get in the habit of looking at the syllabus, that all you had been assigned for Thursday's lecture was the Saussure. Lo and behold, I did take a glance at the syllabus over the weekend and realized that you'd also been assigned the Lévi-Strauss. So we have a little bit of ground to cover today. I think we can do it. I think I want to reserve something like a critique of structuralism for the beginning of Thursday's lecture, because it segues very nicely into what we'll have to say about Derrida. I already promised that somehow or another the critique of structuralism just was deconstruction, and I hope to be able to demonstrate that on Thursday. But I do want to get up to the point of launching a critique of structuralism on 2 or 3 grounds, and so I hope to be able to move along fairly quickly today. Now, another thing that got left out, even given the proviso that it was only about Saussure on Thursday, was an adequate account of the relationship between synchrony and diachrony and the pivotal importance of this concept for not only for semiotics, but for its aftermath in structuralism, and also for its relation to the Russian formalists. Because you remember that in talking about function, the formalists who undertook to think about literary history and the problems of literary historiography were very much engaged in the notion that a function in a given text could be understood in 2 different ways. There was the sin function, which was the relationship between that function and all the other functions in the text. In other words, viewed as an aspect of that text. But there was also, of the same function, its auto function, which is the way in which it persists and recurs throughout the history of literature, sometimes as the dominant, sometimes latent or recessive, but always in one form or another there. Now, in Saussurian linguistics, the relationship between synchrony and diachrony is very much the same. To consider language in toto is to consider it at a given moment synchronically. That is to say, you don't think of language as a system if at the same time you're thinking of it unfolding historically. Now, Jakobson, you will notice, introduces an element of time into the synchronic analysis of a semiotic system by saying that you've got to take account both of archaic and innovative features. But nevertheless, they are simply flagged as archaic or innovative and not understood as changing in time as long as they are read or analyzed synchronically. But at the same token, a system does change through time. A semiotic system, language, the history of literature, the history of poetics, whatever it might be, changes through time. And to analyze that change through time, you think of it diachronically. Now, Saussure argues that the relationship among the parts of something viewed synchronically, a semiotic system, let's say, are not necessary in the sense they might be any number of other relationships, but they are nevertheless fixed. That is to say, they're what's there. They can't be other than what they are. Whereas through time, studying a semiotic system or studying language or whatever it might be, change takes place and it's necessary. You're looking back on it and it simply did happen. And so change is determinate in some sense. But at the same time, it's not regular. This, by the way, is a challenge to certain ideas in traditional linguistics, like, for example, the one you probably all know, the great vowel shift. A structuralist view of language has to argue that the great vowel shift, in which every vowel sound goes up a notch in some mysterious period between the medieval and the early modern, that this only has the appearance of regularity, but that it is actually a diachronic phenomenon that can't be understood in terms of regularity. So the relationship between synchronic and diachronic is of that kind. Now, matters are complicated a little bit on those occasions in your reading when people are talking about the way in which a mass of material, a system of language or other semiotic system, let's say, is inferred from existing data. In other words, the way in which I infer language, long, from sentences, parole, from a sentence, parole. I'm actually concealing from you that, in fact, Saussure uses a third term, langage, to talk about the sum of all sentences. We won't get into that. The way in which language is inferred from parole. Now, language, in other words, is viewed as something in space. That is to say, or as Levi-Strauss calls it, a revertible time, meaning you can go backward and forward within it, but the temporal unfolding is not the important thing about it. So, in space. Whereas parole, speech, unfolds in time. So that parole, because it is temporal, because any speech any of us makes is, in a certain sense, historical. The beginning of the sentence is earlier in history than the end of the sentence. For that reason, there's a relationship between diachrony and the unfolding of parole, or of a sentence, or of an utterance, which is parallel, though at the same time admittedly confusing. One doesn't really want to talk about a sentence as diachronic, but at the same time it does exist on that horizontal axis in which things in a combinatory way unfold in time. All right, so much then for synchrony and diachrony, something we can't get away from. It's in a way the central fact of structuralism, but which I don't think I did adequate justice to at the end of the last lecture. All right, now structuralism. There was an incredible aura about structuralism in the 1960s. It crashed on the shores of the United States, coming in from France, in a way that stunned, amazed, transformed people's lives. People like Kant reading Hume woke up from their dogmatic slumbers, or at least that they felt that that's what they were doing when encountering structuralism. And I mean, to me, it happened when I was a graduate student at Harvard, and absolutely nobody else was paying any attention to it at all. At Yale and Johns Hopkins and Cornell and some other people, they were paying attention to it. But at Harvard, I was initiated to structuralism by a bright undergraduate who seemed to be the only person in Cambridge who knew anything about structuralism, and boy, did he know about structuralism, and got me up to speed as quickly as he could. But it was a phenomenon that was transformative intellectually for people in the academic and beyond the academic world all over the country. And of course, it led to, in all sorts of ways, to most of what's been going on in theory ever since. The amazing thing about it is that as a flourishing and undisputed French contribution to literary theory, it lasted 2 years. Because in 1966, at a famous conference, Jacques Derrida, whom we'll be reading on Thursday, blew it out of the water. But at the same time, and I'll come back to that, at the same time, that is, I mean, to say that it really only lasted 2 years simply isn't fair. The lasting contribution of structuralism, as it's indebted to semiotics, but on its own terms at well, is something one still feels and senses throughout literary theory. And the concrete contributions, not all between 1964, when the first structuralist texts were translated in this country, and 1966, when the conference in Baltimore took place, but the lasting concrete contributions are also terribly important. There's a wonderful book called Enracine by Roland Barthes. Those of you interested in French neoclassical theater cannot imagine, if you haven't read it already, reading a more bracing book. There is an essay on a sonnet of Baudelaire, Les Chats, the Cats, written conjointly by Levi-Strauss and Jakobson, an extraordinary performance, which was the model of a good deal else that was done in the Academy during that period. The anthropologist Edmund Leach wrote a structuralist analysis of Genesis in the Bible, and indeed it's no accident that he writes about Genesis, as I will indicate in a minute and then subsequently. And in addition to all of that, probably the most lasting and rich contributions of the structuralists were in the field that we know as narratology. We'll be taking a look at that when we read Peter Brooks's text in conjunction with Freud a couple of weeks from now. But in the meantime, the key text in narratology, again by Roland Barthes, a long, long essay called The Structural Analysis of Narrative, in which he approaches a James Bond novel as a system of binary pairs and unpacks a deep structure in the novel as a result of this binary analysis. Important books by Tsvetan Todorov, crucial among them, The Grammar of the Decameron, and then a great deal of work published in a series of books called Figures by Gérard Genette, whom you will find quoted repeatedly in the work of Paul de Man that you'll be reading for next Tuesday. And all of this work and a great deal else in the theory of narrative, narratology, is directly indebted to or is actually an aspect of structuralist thought. Now, I promised that I would talk a little bit about the relationship between formalism and semiotics as it clarifies itself in the work of writers like Levi-Strauss and in particular Jakobson. Structuralism takes from, as you can see from Jakobson's analysis, takes from formalism the idea of function. Jakobson is originally, of course, himself a member of the school of Russian formalists, eventually emigrates to Prague, where he is in a circle of people who are already calling themselves structuralists, moves from there to Paris and then to the United States. And so Jakobson, of course, is the one figure who definitely harkens back to both worlds. Having been a formalist, having become a structuralist, one can see the amalgam of these two of these two sets of ideas in his work. From formalism, then, you get the idea of function and the relationship between syn function and auto function, which becomes the relationship between synchrony and diachrony. From semiotics, you get the idea of negative knowledge. That is to say, in Levi-Strauss's analysis of the Oedipus myth, for example, the notion that there's no true version, there's no originary version, there's no sort of positive version of the myth of which everything else is a version. You simply know what you know as it is differentiated from the other things that you know. This one of the essential premises of semiotics, which is essential at the same time in structuralism. Now, unlike, because here's where structuralism can be understood as an entity in itself, unlike formalism, structuralism has an ambition with respect to the object, to the nature of the object, which is quite new. And I think that the best way to epitomize that is to turn to an aphorism of Roland Barthes in the essay The Structuralist Activity on page 871, toward the bottom of the right-hand column, where Barthes says, "Structural man takes the real, decomposes it, then recomposes it." This is the moment in which you can see the radical difference between what structuralism is doing and what formalism is doing. Formalism takes the object and it doesn't decompose it. It sees the object as it is. It just breaks it down into its respective functions, showing them dynamically in relationship with each other and as a system of dominance and subordination. All of it understood as the way in which something is made, the way in which it is put together. But there's no question of anything other than the object. Gogol's overcoat, Cervantes' Don Quixote, Sterne's Tristram Shandy. These are objects, and there's no question of somehow or another creating a virtual object, for example, the novel, out of one's remarks about individual text. In a way, though, that's what, as you can see, again from Levi-Strauss's analysis of the Oedipus myth, that's what structuralism is doing. As Barthes says, structural man takes the real, decomposes it, then recomposes it. So what he means by that is you take a bunch of variants, versions, you take a bunch of data, not necessarily all the data, but a representative amount of the data relevant to any given idea or concept. And then you say, well, what are the, and this is where he gets into the idea of, gross constituent units. What are the basic constituent units of all of these items of data? Oh yeah, I see we can put them into a pattern. We'll work on this a little bit in a minute. Yeah, I see how this is working. As a matter of fact, there is a kind of virtual object that I can begin to observe as I organize the data that I garner from all the individual entities or versions that fall under this umbrella. And that's the recomposition, not of any particular object, but of a kind of virtual object which begins to emerge from one's analysis. In the case of Levi-Strauss's text, the meaning of the Oedipus myth. That's the virtual object that structuralist analysis arrives at by arranging, analyzing, and classifying the data that it can get from all the available versions of the Oedipus myth. So structuralism decomposes, but not just for the sake of seeing how something works, like taking apart the parts of an engine. Not just to see how something works, but in order to lend the parts to an analysis of a body of materials that makes it possible to recompose all those parts in a new virtual object. That's what's going on in what Barthes calls the structuralist activity. So quickly, let's take a look at the Levi-Strauss chart, if you want to call it that, of the Oedipus myth, which is on page 864 in your text, and just say a word or two about it. He takes a lot of versions. Let's not trouble ourselves with how many. He doesn't have nearly as many versions, by the way, as he would have if he were studying a North American Indian myth or the sorts of myths that he did study in a variety of versions as an anthropologist, but he has some versions. One of them, by the way, Freud's version. One of them, Sophocles' version, and a variety of versions besides those. And he says, you know, as you look at these various versions, you can see that certain things are basically happening, and they fall into certain discrete categories. We can put them in columns, that is to say, in terms of the way in which they share a common theme, but we can also put those columns in a row so that we can analyze the way in which the columns relate to each other. For example, there's a group of events, happenstances, sort of naming accidents, and so on, that falls into a column called Overdetermination of blood relations. That is to say, when Antigone tries to bury her brother and goes to the wall for that in ways that you might find excessive, that's an overdetermination of blood relations. And then you notice that at the same time, there's a series of actions in the myth going all the way back to Oedipus's family history and then down through the history of his offspring and so on, that there's also a series of actions which have to do with the undervaluation of blood relations. You know, people, well, they don't really seem to care as much about blood relations as they should, and as a result of that, bad things happen too. And then there's a column of issues which have to do with the way in which recurrently in all the versions of the myth there seems to be a strange preoccupation with that which is born from the earth. Monsters, you know, the teeth of monsters that are scattered and become the alphabet in the story of Cadmus, and the variety of ways in which heroes have to confront monsters as Oedipus confronts the Sphinx. And all of these monsters are understood as not being born from parents, as being born from two things, but instead as emerging from the earth. They are chthonic or autochthonous, in Levi-Strauss's word. And there seems to be a strange preoccupation with autochthony in this myth. But this is offset by the way in which that is to say, with fending off autochthony, as if the crucial thing were to insist on the binary parental relationship that produces us, to be reassured in our humanity by the idea that one of us is born from two. But then, on the other hand, there are all kinds of things in the myth which are also preoccupied with autochthony in precisely the opposite way. Lambda, the word that begins so many of the names of the figures in Oedipus's genealogy, Labdacus, Laius, and so on. Lambda looks like a limping person, right? Oedipus means swellfoot, one who limps. And what emerges in the fourth column is the idea that there are signs of autochthony in our own makeup. The reason we limp is that we have a foot of clay, that something of the earth from which we were born sticks to us. And this is a recurrent pattern, a recurrent idea in the unfolding of the Oedipus myth. It's a peculiar thing, but notice that this is one of those occasions on which the myth explodes into other cultures. Adam means red clay. Adam is born from the earth in the sense that red clay is taken from the earth and he is created. And there seems to be the same preoccupation with autochthony in the Oedipus myth as well, one of the interesting links of that myth with the Christian myth of the origin of man. So you got 4 columns: overvaluation of blood relations, undervaluation of blood relations, denial of autochthony, persistence of autochthony. All right, I'm going to leave it at that for now, because we'll come back later to see what interesting thing is going on in the way in which these 4 columns are all about 2 versus 1. That is to say, whether or not we are born from 2 or born from 1. And I want to come back to that, to that in the context of showing that in a certain way, the question whether things come from 2, ideas, for example, come from 2 different things, or whether ideas come from 1 object, is, after all, this question is itself an allegory of the structuralist activity. That's what structuralism itself is about, and that's what makes it so interesting and even perhaps peculiar that Levi-Strauss is able to find not just any thought in a myth, but the very thinking that he himself is doing about the myth. So, and that, of course, may have something to do with your sense that surely decomposing in order to recompose, creating a virtual systemic object. Notice that I've made this a dotted line. Creating a virtual systemic object, that there's a kind of a circularity in that. You know, you look at, I mean, I hope I've explained Levi-Strauss's 4 columns intelligibly. But if you look at those 4 columns, you say to yourself, how on earth did he come up with that? You know, and he himself says, oh, well, maybe I could have done it some other way, you know, and you say to yourself, how can this become decisive? How can it become authoritative? Right? You can see what he's doing, and by the way, you can confirm it by thinking of things that he leaves out. Jocasta hangs herself. He doesn't mention that. It's not in any of the 4 columns. But obviously that has something to do, you can take your choice, either between the overdetermination or underdetermination of blood relations. She feels guilty because she committed incest. Right? Oedipus, at his birth, is hamstrung and exposed on Mount Kithaeron. Levi-Strauss doesn't mention that either, but obviously that's why Oedipus limps. Oedipus is a limping person like the letter lambda, right? And so plainly that must have something to do with the persistence of autochthony. And finally, if you read the Oedipus Colonus, you know that at the end of it, Oedipus, when he dies, is swallowed up by the earth. Dust thou art, to dust thou shalt return. The equivalent of this in the Oedipus myth is that where I came from, the earth is where I will go. And he becomes a kind of genius of the place at Colonus as a result of having been swallowed up there. He becomes a kind of presiding spirit or genius of the place. So all of those things, which we ourselves thought of, he didn't think of them, he didn't put them in his diagram, can, however, be put in his diagram. And if that's the case, we have to say to ourselves, there might be something in this. Maybe this is a plausible and interesting way of arranging these materials. So I really do think that ought to be said in defense of what may seem, however, to be a somewhat arbitrary exercise. Now, turning to Jakobson. You may say, with all this emphasis I've been throwing on decomposing in order to recompose, that you don't see that going on in what Jakobson is saying. You may say to yourself, well, he seems to be just doing formalism, you know. He breaks any speech act into 6 functions. He talks about the interdeterminacy of those 6 functions with a certain result. That sounds just like formalism. You say, well, one way to show the way in which what Jakobson is doing is structuralist is to say that, after all, in this essay, there's a lot more of the essay, by the way, which your editor doesn't give you. It's mostly about versification, which is the long-standing specialty of Jakobson's work, Russian versification, Czech versification, classification and so on, and a little technical. But it is all about the poetic function. After all, this essay is about the poetic function, what the formalists would call literariness. But Jakobson has a real contribution to make to this notion of the poetic function. And what it is basically this. The poetic function, and I'm going to quote this for the first time. It's on page 858 in the left-hand column. And it's a mouthful. The poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection to the axis of combination. Now you understand. The poetic function projects the principle of equivalence from the axis of selection to the axis of combination. What is the principle of equivalence? You've got that, you've got a good deal of it. The principle of equivalence can be understood as what Jakobson in the aphasia essay calls metaphor. That is to say, the way in which, you remember last time I talked about how signs cluster on the in the vertical axis. If we understand language as a system, there are some signs that relate to other signs in ways that they probably don't relate to yet other signs. And then I had an incredible lapse of memory. I couldn't remember a synonym for ship, but I still hope that I hope that I got my point across to you and indicated that there are varieties of ways in which any given sign cluster with other signs. Those ways of clustering are what Jakobson calls the principle of equivalence. What is it? Well, it's the way in which signs either are similar to each other or are dissimilar to each other. If that sounds too vague, maybe it's better not to use language of difference or similarity, but actually to use language of opposition. In other words, the way in which signs are virtually synonymous, or the way in which signs are really and truly opposed to each other. Obviously, it stretches, just as in versification. You don't just have full rhyme, you have slant rhyme. These relationships stretch in varieties of ways of this kind. But the principle of equivalence is the way in which signs, understood as phonemes, lexemes, tagmemes, however you want to understand them, the way in which signs are similar or dissimilar. The readiness with which we combine signs of that kind is what a person attending to the poetic function looks for. If the utterance seems to involve a predominance of equivalences of various kinds, then this utterance, which is unfolding on the axis of combination, right, is the result of having projected that principle of equivalence, call it metaphor, call it a principle of similarity or dissimilarity, from the axis of selection, that is to say, that axis, perhaps a virtual one, in which language is a system, to the axis of combination. That real axis, because nobody doubts the existence of speech, that real axis in which language is not a system but has become speech unfolding in time. The principle of the poetic function, however, can be understood then as the metaphorization of what is otherwise metonymic. In other words, if I put together a sentence, what I'm doing is I'm putting words next to each other. And that's what metonymy is. And metonymy is a selection of signs, if you will, that go appropriately next to each other, according to the rules of grammar and syntax, according to the rules of logic, right? But also, perhaps, in the ways in which the rhetorical device of metonymy can be understood. If I say, if I say hut instead of house, I'm using an example actually taken from Jakobson's aphasia essay. If I say hut instead of house, and if I say the hut is small, there is a metonymic relationship implied with houses, shacks, mansions, other sorts of edifice, but which can only really be resolved perhaps by the unfolding of the logic of the sentence, as in when I say the hut is small. And so combinatory processes, borrowing the rhetorical term metonymy as that which is next to each other, are basically metonymic. The available signs to be selected, on the other hand, on the axis of selection, are selected for certain purposes if they are metaphoric. Obviously, if I'm just making a sentence, I'm not selecting signs because they're metaphoric. I selected because they go easily next to each other, either for reasons of grammar or syntax or logic. Now let's look at Jakobson's 6 functions taken all together. I think this is by no means difficult, and I think that Jakobson's analysis of the 6 functions is just absolutely, totally brilliant. In fact, I think that, I'm so profoundly convinced by what Jakobson says about these 6 functions that I really think there isn't much else to say about an utterance. Obviously, in different registers, there's lots to say. But in the spirit of Jakobsonian analysis, there's no possible complaint you can make about this, except possibly one, which I probably won't get to until next time. But in the meantime, it's just staggeringly effective. And let me use the example of a word, of an expression which is surely as uninteresting. I've groped as much as I could to find the most uninteresting possible expression to show the way in which any utterance whatsoever entails these 6 functions. It is raining. Oh, boy, excitement reigns, as they say. So in any case, let's say that I am an addresser. That is to say, I'm a romantic poet. And I say, probably ill-advisedly if I'm a poet, but I'm a romantic poet, and I say, sort of waking everybody up when I say it, it is raining. All right, what do I mean? What do I mean if I'm a romantic poet? What I mean to say is I'm singing in the rain, or it's raining in my heart. In other words, I'm expressing something emotional in saying it is raining. So that sense of the expression it is raining is what Jakobson calls the emotive function. Now, I'm being addressed. The thrust of the message is toward the addressee. It's being spoken by an addresser, but it's aimed at an addressee. That addressee is a small child going out the door without his coat on. And his mother or father says, "It is raining," right? Which means, of course, as a conative function, as a command, as something which has a design on the addressee, what it means is, put your coat on. But you don't necessarily say, put your coat on. You say, it is raining. And that's the conative function. That's what Jakobson calls the set to the addressee. That is to say, the basic dominant bearing that the message has. The set is a set to the addressee. Now, there's a context for any utterance. This much, I suppose, none of us would think to disagree with. I'm a weatherman. I'm a meteorologist, right? I don't even have to look out the window. I look at my charts, and I announce confidently through the microphone, it is raining, right? And everybody takes me seriously. I mean, the referential function of it is raining is supposed to convey information. I'm a weatherman. I'm supposed to know what I'm talking about. So if a weatherman tells me it is raining, I believe that it is raining. I put my hand out the door, and sure enough, it is raining. And the referential function, the dominant in the expression "it is raining," as referential function, has been confirmed. I don't expect the weatherman to be telling me somehow secretly that he's crying when he says it is raining, right? Right? I expect him to tell me the truth about the weather, right? And that's what I'm listening to him for. All right. Now, the set to the contact, Jakobson gives you those wonderful examples from Dorothy Parker's representation of a date. Just, whoa, boy. Well, here we are. Yeah. Here we are. Yeah, we sure are here. And so on, right? In other words, in a state of abject and acute nervousness, filling the air with words, right? So that you know, you're on a date, right? And you can't think of anything to say. I really feel sorry for you. You're on a date, and you can't think of anything to say, so you say, it is raining. And of course, your interlocutor says, yeah, it's raining. And you say, it's raining hard, you know, and you're, well, yeah, maybe it'll stop soon. And so, you know, and so the conversation continues. And that's the phatic function, checking to make sure the contact is working. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Can you hear me? That's what the set to the contact is. Anything that confirms that you're actually sort of in communication with somebody. And anything we can say has that component. I mean, if I'm a physicist and I'm going out on a date with another physicist, I say E equals mc squared, you know. And I'm not saying E equals mc squared. I'm filling the air with words. And so once again, it's the set to the contact. And any message in the right context has that function. The set to the code is when we're not sure that we adequately share the code with another person on a given occasion, so that we back away from simply saying things to make sure that what we're saying is clear. In other words, to define them. I say there's a mare in the field. Somebody says, what is a mare? Well, it's a female horse. Well, it's a female horse is the metalingual function. But we're talking about it is raining. This is where it really gets interesting. The most interesting thing about it is raining in terms of these 6 functions is metalingual, because what on earth is it? Right? Somebody tells me it is raining. I say, what? What are you talking about? What is it? I have absolutely no idea what you're saying. I've noticed that other languages have this same weird phenomenon. Il pleut, es regnet. What on earth does any of that mean? What is il? What is es? What is it? Is it God? Is it Jupiter Pluvius? Is it the cloud canopy? Well, it sort of is the cloud canopy, but that's sort of clearly not what's meant by it, right? It is a kind of grammatical and syntactical anomaly which is extremely difficult even for linguists to analyze and to explain. And so that when I try to say it is raining, I can expect the metalingual, and if I'm talking to a literalist, of course, I can expect the metalingual function to kick in and, in fact, bite me in the shin. It's no picnic with the metalingual function in mind saying it is raining. What kind of a definition of it is it's raining? You know? And so problems arise, but they're interesting problems, and they are a function, one of the 6 functions of the expression it is raining. Poetic function is unfortunately not very interesting. That's the one drawback of this example, but there's still plenty to say. I, and the I in raining, which one can hear, the double I in raining. The monosyllables suggesting, you know, sort of a kind of a quick declaration of something followed by a sense of duration that one always feels when one is aware of rain coming down. It is raining, so that the duration or prolongation of the word has a kind of semantic value indicating to us that this is something ongoing. In other words, a variety of ways in which the poetic function of it is raining can be considered. For the poetic function to be dominant, as I suggested when I said a romantic poet wouldn't be very smart if he or she said it was raining, for the poetic function to be dominant would really be taxing for anyone who wanted to make it so. But it could be. Any function could be the dominant in a certain situation of any given utterance. And so so that then sort of perhaps to suffice as an analysis of Jakobson's understanding of the structure of an utterance. And it has a structure insofar, that is to say, a metaphoric as opposed to a metonymic structure, insofar as we observe the presence of some kind of pressure from the axis of selection, the principle of equivalence and the axis of selection, bringing itself to bear on the way in which the combination takes place. It's just incredible that, you know, you say it is raining. What could be more prosaic than it is raining? And all of a sudden you notice that string of eyes. You notice all kinds of other things about it. I mean, it is the way in which the most banal utterance is combined is likely in one form or another, almost unavoidable. I suppose I should use the strong argument and say unavoidably, is likely unavoidably to entail aspects of the poetic function. Where the poetic function is dominant, you have literariness, and that, of course, is the old object of scientific attention of the Russian formalists. But it is refined in a way that I think is structuralist by Jakobson, because he insists on the binary nature of the process of combining elements from the axis of selection if they are equivalent. Binary being same, opposite, similar, dissimilar, and the variety of patterns in which those relations, same, opposite, similar, dissimilar, can be launched into use. Now, I've actually reached the point at which possibly I could get involved in some elements of critique. And I suppose I'll begin. I may not finish, but we can always carry over into the next lecture. So since we've been talking about Jakobson, let me call your attention to one problem in what seems to me otherwise to be a truly remarkable exercise of thought. And that problem arises on page 858. And he himself recognizes that it's a problem. He acknowledges it's a problem, but he wants to say that he's solved it in saying what he says. It's about 2/3 of the way down the page, and it's about the relationship between the poetic function and the metalingual function, between the set to the message and the set to the code, as he puts it. And this is what he said. It may be objected, and here we are, objecting, right? It may be objected that metalanguage also makes a sequential use of equivalent units when combining synonymic expressions into an equational sentence. A equals A. Mare is the female of the horse. Poetry and metalanguage, however, are in diametrical opposition to each other. They're not the same, right? They're in diametrical opposition to each other. In metalanguage, the sequence is used to build an equation. In other words, to prove that two things are that one term can be understood in terms of other terms. The sequence is used to build an equation, whereas in poetry, the equation is used to build a sequence. Okay. Now, in one sense, this is true, obviously. Yes, that is, I know when I'm speaking metalanguage, and I know when I'm speaking poetry. Maybe you know it too. But what Jakobson has actually done is he's sort of exposed a structuralist nerve, because he has appealed to intention. That is to say, he said, the metalingual expression has one intention, and the poetic expression has another intention. What does that mean? It has a genesis. It has an origin in an intending consciousness. Just as in traditions not structuralist, things have origins in prior causes and not in their structural relationship between two things. In other words, if structuralism is a critique of Genesis, as is the case with Edmund Leach's analysis of the biblical text Genesis, as is the case certainly with Levi-Strauss's understanding of the Oedipus myth from two and not from one, if structuralism is a critique of Genesis, what happens when you have to make a distinction between two entities in your system, the poetic function and the metalingual function, in terms of their genesis? That is to say, in terms of the intention that stands behind them. As I said, the example seems trivial because we're all more than prepared to agree with Jakobson that we know the difference when we see it between the metalingual and the poetic functions. But he's not actually saying we know the difference when we see it. Maybe it would have been better if he had said it. Well, anybody can see what's metalingual and what's poetic. Maybe, maybe it would have been better if he had. What he says instead is metalingual is intended to do one thing, poetic is intended to do another thing. That opens, actually, a can of worms about all 6 functions. I stand here in front of you, and I say, it is raining. How do you know what I'm intending, right? Whether I'm nervous and sort of just being phatic, whether I am really unhappy or happy, whether I think you're crazy, it is in fact raining outside and I don't see any coats, whether I am actually sort of just masquerading as an English professor, I'm really a meteorologist. You don't know any of these things. You have to infer an intention, all right? And if you infer an intention in order to make these distinctions, how can the structuralist imperative of structure rather than genesis be preserved intact? How can we insist that we know negative things negatively and not positively if we have to infer a direct cause, a positive cause, in order to grasp distinctions even between the 6 functions? Now, that's a rhetorical question with which I don't necessarily agree, but it is a potential objection that you may wish to explore on your own. Now, the critique of Lévi-Strauss I've already hinted at, but there's another aspect of it too. That I will defer until next time, because you'll find that that the essay of Derrida that you're reading is largely about Lévi-Strauss. So it will make a natural segue between what we're talking about today and what we'll be talking about Thursday, to return first to certain aspects of Lévi-Strauss's argument and then get going with what Derrida is saying. Thank you. See you then.
yo 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 yo